Now we're on to part 3 of Sókè. And I am beginning with this section that I titled To Sókè or nudákẹ, Lekki Tollgate Massacre in Local and Global Perspective. In the early evening of Tuesday, October 20th, 2020, thousands of demonstrators gathered in various locations in Nigeria, including at the Lekki Tollgate in Lagos, to protest decades of police brutality at the hands of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, SARS. The peaceful protesters were met with shows of force. Those at the Lekki Tollgate faced a hail of gunfire from the Nigerian army after the authorities had turned off the floodlights and cameras at the toll gate. Protesters were also killed in Mushin, Alausa, and other locations in Lagos and also in other parts of the country. Reports vary, but at least 15 persons were identified as killed and many more were injured. This brutal act by the Nigerian post-colonial state created widespread outrage and brought the movement global public attention. This is in large part due to the youth Sókè or Speak Up generation being so-called digital natives who were able to use the tools of information technology skillfully and effectively. While the older generation, who they see as the nudákẹ or be quiet generation, have been classified by some as digital migrants who are less adept at deploying the tools to disseminate information and protest. The struggle for social justice and freedom by labor, women, students, and minorities against repression is an integral part of Nigeria's story. Although the historical contexts differ, the #EndSARS protests are part of a larger struggle. Dubbing the older generation as nudákẹ, as I said before, shows scant awareness of this history. But there's also considerable symbolic appropriation of that older generation's words, signals, and methods. One sees this in Afrobeat and Nollywood. Afrobeat musicians appropriate Fela's lyrics and style, but there's insufficient awareness of his politics, influence, and philosophy of being. Fela articulated, quote, popular political dissent, according to Olaniyan in 2004. Fela, in his language, was understandable to the masses. They knew what he was saying and they could relate to a lot of his protests as relevant to themselves. He was very counterculture in a way that so many youths who want to succeed in a neoliberal world cannot be. A generation that did not experience military rule and the history of Nigeria in all its complexity and one where many members did not learn history as a subject in school, is bound to have a clear disconnect between past and present. The role of the older generation is not as cut and dried as the nudákẹ moniker suggests. Protests demanding democratic rights and justice are well documented in Nigeria. During the colonial era, for example, some notable protests were by labor. For example, the uprising by coal miners in Enugu. There was also the Igbo Women's War of the 1930s and the Abeokuta women's protests in the 1940s that succeeded in pushing the Alake, the Oba of Abeokuta, to abdicate. There were also protests by Lagos Market Women's Association, and the government response to many of these protests was violent. The government inflicted heavy costs on protesters, including deaths, serious injuries, arrests, long periods in jail, and imprisonment. The older generation, of course, did not have the technological tools that the Sókè generation have, so their action did not have as wide a scope, and they lacked the real-time element of today's social media communication. The historical moment also differed in significant ways. Structurally, the world operated differently. In the colonial era, imperialism was legitimized by the international system, and the protests by Nigerians were directed at invalidating it. In contemporary times, globalization has legitimated neoliberalism with new forms of imperialism that do not involve the establishment of physical dominion over territories, but where the imposition of economic conditions that almost make the independence and autonomy that was sought in the earlier era and accomplished through independence a mere mirage. The difference between the older generation and the new, therefore, is not about the Sókè nudákẹ divide, but that each generation came of age in a different era with different structural conditions. And the structural conditions imposed limits on the realm of the possible. Even the transnational aspects of the #EndSARS protests have a precursor in the ways in which the Pan-African movement supported struggles for African independence. That generation used the technology that was at its disposal, as rudimentary as it was, and this generation is doing likewise. The involvement of the social media savvy queer community is also a new phenomenon because this community affirmed its presence and right to participate in public discourse in a clear way that differs from past under-the-radar strategies employed to keep the members of the community safe from persecution and targeted brutal repression. However, even within the increased space for the queer community during the #EndSARS protests, there were homophobic responses that sought to silence the community, and this contributed to limiting the inclusivity of the protests to incorporate people who also were targeted by the SARS units. The response of the feminist coalition to the homophobic resistance to the queer community's participation was initially to declare support for the community and to affirm their inclusion in the protests, but they were forced to douse down their vocality on the matter. Such limitations also divided the protesters and reduced the democratic potential of the protests. After the attacks on peaceful protesters, attempts by the Nigerian state to draw the leaders of the movement into negotiations failed. The protesters responded that everyone was a leader, which was an unheard of position in Nigerian politics, but one that is now clearly observable in postmodern political and social movements, where, like the EndSARS phenomenon, horizontal modes of organizing have become normalized. The disappearance of protesters from public view and relative silence in the public sphere should not be taken as an indicator of the end of the protests, an acceptance of or acquiescence to the status quo. The protests are better seen as paused and going underground to regroup. Many analysts, predominantly from the nudákẹ generation, have criticized the Sókè youths for being, quote unquote, disorganized and for exhibiting profound naivete. To the contrary, I argue that their leaderlessness is a necessary political strategy and that it reflects new modes of horizontal social movement organizing that are part of the ideological influences and mobilization strategies being disseminated and applied worldwide today. Though not entirely without problems, we have seen the effectiveness of this strategy in movements including Occupy Wall Street and its various iterations around the world, even in Nigeria, where there was a hashtag Occupy Nigeria protest. We also see it in the Arab Spring, the 2019 to 2020 anti-extradition law amendment bill movement in Hong Kong, and in the Black Lives Matter movement. The hashtag EndSARS youth protesters organized and mobilized all over Nigeria. State violence suppression was also nationwide. The protesters should be recognized as bold, confident, courageous, aware of their generational responsibilities, the world they live in, both in terms of the local and the regional, as well as the global contexts. Their actions are timely and important. It is admirable that they were highly organized, providing food, water, charging stations for the electronic devices and smartphones, medical treatment, and legal assistance for protesters. The protesters also used Pidgin English, Nigerian languages, and made efforts to be understandable to ordinary people. There are noticeable global forces immediately at play in the emergence of the hashtag EndSARS protests. The resistance was inspired, triggered, and influenced by the initial success of the anti-racist movement that followed the lynching of George Floyd and the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. This was evident in the similarities of language, expressions, and demands. There was also declaration by the Black Lives Matter movement that they supported the hashtag EndSARS protests, embracing them as part of the global Black Lives Matter movement, and exhorting anyone that read their blog to find out more by following the Feminist Coalition on Twitter and Instagram. Readers were also encouraged to disseminate the information and support the Nigerian youth protesters by joining solidarity protests, making donations, and similarly supporting other protests in the African continent. Zimbabwe, Cameroon, and Namibia were identified as examples of places where similar movements were in process and places that Black Lives Matter supporters should similarly support. There was also some sameness in the language used. #EndSARS protesters also insisted that Black Lives Matter. There were similar modes of organization. It was horizontal rather than vertical. Similar attitudes were displayed to formal politics. The protesters did not seek entry into the political system through forming parties and running for elections. They sought to use street-level action and popular modes of protest to influence changes in government policy, particularly concerning police brutality, injustices, human rights abuses, impunity, and lack of commitment to democratic principles. The Nigerian mass protests are a coalition of various forces, but the voices of the subaltern are obscured. A prominent divide and rule tactic by the political establishment, who are predominantly from the older generation, makes tendentious distinctions between legitimate protesters who are peaceful and mostly middle class and quote unquote hoodlums and vagabonds and violent protesters that they believe should be rounded up and punished or silenced. The queer and feminist communities in particular have been targeted to split and disorganize the movement. So far, such attempts have failed thanks to the ideological sophistication and skills of the activists, but they have also exposed the fault lines within Nigerian activism. What began as protests against police brutality and for civil rights was morphing into a broader movement for social transformation before the Lekki Toll Gates massacre and brutal, punitive state action suppressed the protests and put the protesters out of commission. There is yet to be significant scholarly documentation interrogating and analyzing the meanings, possibilities, and limits of this movement. There have been similar protests in the past, but they have not crossed ethnic, religious, class, and sexuality-based lines. This movement brings together Christians, Muslims, and adherents of indigenous religions who have had public performances of religiosity. It also brings together people whose presence and voices were hitherto suppressed, the queer community, for example, with those who have conventionally been vocal and well represented in protests, heterosexual EndSARS protesters. Women were also prominent both as leaders and participants in the protests. Women carried placards, led in the management of logistics by coordinating the protests, mobilized the protesters through chants, music, and encouragement. Particularly notable is the management of the finances of the movement by the Feminist Coalition, a group of young women who used Flutterwave, an online payments processing company, to collect donations. Between October 8 and 13, When the Nigerian government disabled the account, the feminist coalition was able to collect 25 million naira or $55,000 at the time. This indicates that Nigeria is at a turning point that may yet produce more inclusive politics that transcends its current heteronormative bias. So we shall take another pause, and part 4 is coming.